Thanks very much, Gail, and welcome everybody. I don't know about you, but I can hear a bell every time somebody comes in the room. I don't know if you want to mute that or not, but in any case, maybe it's just my end. I'm really honored to be here. I'm going to make a few opening remarks and then go to the slideshow portion of my presentation. And so the opening remarks about 5-6 minutes, the slideshow about 15. And then hopefully we'll have a lively discussion with all of you here tonight. So thanks for taking your time during the dinner hour. So I don't know about you, but I'm having a hard time getting my head around how on earth the response to the war in Ukraine and the obvious vulnerabilities of the reactors there is, hey, we need is more nuclear reactors. And yet that's the response we've seen here in the US, in the UK, in France, inevitably, not in Germany though, but many, many countries eager to develop nuclear power programs. And I've been thinking a lot about this, you know, what accounts for it? It seems completely mad. And I think maybe part of what accounts for it is that there's no human face to this story. It's all about technology and profits and exports and the illusion of jobs and false notions of national security. And there's just a complete disconnect with the reality of what nuclear power is about. Years ago, before I was in this line of work, my father, who was an nuclear physicist, remonstrated with me, when you turn the light on, he said, don't you ask yourself where the electricity comes from? And my answer then was almost certainly, no, not really, probably like most people, because I hadn't really thought about it. But today, with a heightened awareness about the climate crisis, more people probably do think about it, or at least let's hope they do. But what do they think about when they see nuclear power listed as a source on their electricity bill? 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, Fukushima, or do they think, hey, nuclear, essential for climate? Which messaging has resonated with them? So back then, when my father asked me that question, I was probably thinking about coal. And so raised on the novels of Zola and D.H. Lawrence, the pictures that came to mind were likely soot-faced coal miners, struggle, toil, black lung. I'd have remembered the Aberfan disaster in Wales when a slag heap of coal slurry roared down its artificial mountain and swallowed a school full of children. And later, the strikes and the blackouts and Welsh valleys starved into submission by Margaret Thatcher. I'd have pictured the blackened faces of white people, people I recognized as my own. Today, when we talk about nuclear power, as many of us gathered here probably do on a regular basis, what pictures do we paint for those listening? By necessity, we must talk about cost per kilowatt hour and carbon footprints and small modular nuclear reactors and long-lived nuclear waste. And if we're very unlucky, zirconium cladding and high assay, low enriched uranium fuel, and even positive void coefficients and alkali silica reactions. And yes, all these things are important. And if only they'd listen and see we were right and wake up and realize that new nuclear power plants have nothing whatever to do with climate change, nothing. And old nuclear power plants are exactly that, old and decrepit and dangerous and expensive to fix, and keeping them going starves out the real solutions like renewables, and we pay for them. So what pictures am I painting? Did I lose you yet? You know, messaging is important, and all these things are important, and we have to be accurate. And yes, we are right, but being right isn't enough. It's never been enough. And clinging to the idea that if we just blast them with enough facts, then they'll be with us is like chipping away at a block of granite with a toothpick. Up there on Capitol Hill, and as we've seen, most especially in Illinois, as well as Ohio and South Carolina, on Capitol Hill and in our state houses across the country, they are bought and sold 2 and 3 times over. They shall not be moved by our facts. The thing is that nuclear power happens to people. And what happens to them is, a lot of the time, a crime. It's a crime against race, against justice, against the environment, against animals. It's a crime against humanity. But it's almost never looked at through that frame. Today, when people see nuclear power on their electric bill, they don't know who really paid before they switched their lights on. When Volodymyr Zelensky addressed Congress, he didn't give them military statistics. He showed a video of what was happening to people in his country. Like him or not, and yes, he's an actor, and that was likely a well-rehearsed performance, it worked. Why did it work? Because it moved people. It hit them where it hurt, their values. It established empathy. And yet, let's remember that far from the battlefields of Ukraine, people are dying in Yemen and Syria and Congo and Gaza and Afghanistan. And Africans fleeing Ukraine are being turned back at the Polish border, and no one in Congress is giving any of them a standing ovation. It's about race, just as nuclear power, when it happens to people, is almost always about race, or about poverty, or about disenfranchisement, but not about democracy. Who does nuclear power benefit? And more importantly, who does it hurt? It hurts those forgotten faces of the uranium fuel chain, native faces, black faces, brown faces, and yes, some white faces, the people to whom nuclear power happens. And we too are sometimes guilty of forgetting them, of omitting to tell their stories, of omitting to let them tell their own stories. Putting the face on the nuclear power story gives that story empathy, power. It makes it personal. So as we message on nuclear power, let's try to remember to do that more, to tell more stories, to talk to the people to whom it happens, and to really listen, to tell their stories and to give them the platform, the mic. Tonight, perforce, we must do the storytelling ourselves. So I'm now going to shift to the slideshow portion of my presentation. So I'm just going to share my screen with you and begin that. Hopefully everybody can see that okay. So when we begin the story of, oh, sorry, I lost the slideshow here. Let me start again. There we go. When we begin the story, we start with uranium mining. And whose story is this? When we talk about uranium mining, we are on Native American land, on First Nations territory, in Aboriginal country in Australia, in the Congo, now the site of a new Holocaust with 5 million dead, the fighting mostly over mineral rights. When we talk about uranium mining, we are walking on the sands of the Sahel with a nomadic Tuareg. We are among impoverished families in India, in Namibia, in Kazakhstan. In all these places, we find people whose ancient beliefs were centered in stewardship of the earth. And as such, their tales and legends talk of dragons and serpents and yellow dust underground that must never be disturbed. And as the uranium mining corporations dig and desecrate and destroy, the rainbow serpent is released. Uranium, the lethal force that would become the fuel for nuclear power and for nuclear weapons. And those who release it are the very people who warned against doing any such thing. And they are the ones whose lives are destroyed as a result. When we look at the history of uranium mining, we are seeing a genocide, because a genocide is not just a massacre. A genocide is also the erasure of people culturally. It is the destruction of a way of life. In the United States, what is left behind after the uranium companies have completed their plunder on Navajo land, on Hopi, Zuni, Laguna, Acoma, Lakota? What we find are people already exiled, still condemned to no running water, even today, no electricity, spiraling into alcoholism, the highest unemployment and suicide rates, domestic abuse, where young Native girls disappear at an alarming rate, often at the hands of white predators trespassing on Indian land, where COVID-19 killed people at a higher rate than anywhere else in the country. Those are the riches that uranium mining delivers, and it's true everywhere. In Niger, in Arlit, a dusty desert town in the Sahel, people who work at the French-owned uranium mine live in shacks with no water or electricity. The walls, sometimes built as this dwelling was, with radioactive scraps foraged from the uranium mine site. In the distance, there is a mountain. It isn't real, but it isn't a mirage either. It's a tailings pile, ravaged by the Sahara winds, scattering radioactivity far and wide. And Arriva, now Orano, which mines there, makes millions on the backs of the sweat and toil of people whose children pick up radioactive rocks from the sandy streets and whose fathers die in the local hospital where the Arriva hired doctors tell them their fatal illnesses had nothing whatever to do with exposures at the mines. When Guria Das died in her village in Jadagoda, India, she had the body of a 3-year-old. She was 13. She could not speak, she could not move. Nearby, the Uranium Corporation of India Limited, whose acronym appropriately spells out UKIL, keeps working 6 uranium mines, its tailing ponds leaching poison into a community ravaged by disease and birth defects, but who are told, of course, that their problems have nothing whatever to do with the uranium mines. And then that uranium is turned into fuel to power our reactors. In Erwin, Tennessee, they process weapons-grade uranium fuel into fuel for nuclear power plants. There are stories here too. Here is what one person wrote. I know we ate radiation straight from Mama's garden. Our beloved little dog died of cancer. My dad died at 56 with colon cancer. Our next door neighbor died of colon cancer. I doubt she was 60. A friend and close neighbor had extensive colon cancer in his early 30s. I had a huge lymphoma removed from my heart at the age of 30. My brother had kidney failure in his early 30s. My sister and I both have thyroid nodules and weird protein levels in our blood that can lead to multiple myelinosis. And then that fuel gets loaded into a nuclear power plant and the story continues. We are in Illinois in the early 2000s, where far too many children living close to 2 nuclear power plants and a closed reprocessing plant are suffering from brain cancer. Childhood brain cancer is extremely rare. Here there are numerous cases and they are rising. The children are taken away to Chicago for medical treatment and some die there. So their deaths are not recorded in the statistics of their local community. In this way, their deaths have nothing whatever to do with the nuclear power plants. Sarah Sauer, pictured here, and whose parents fought a vigorous campaign for truth and justice, was one of the survivors. In Shell Bluff, Georgia, a poor African-American community fought to stop the construction of the Vogtle 1 and 2 reactors. They lost. Then they fought again against 2 new reactors, Vogtle 3 and 4, and they lost again. We noticed that lots of folks started coming down with cancer, remembered longtime Shell Bluff resident Annie Stevens, pictured here. My daddy, mama, sister, 2 brothers died of cancer, and another living brother now has cancer. My aunt, a cousin, and other folks down the road, on the river, died of cancer. In Port Gibson, Mississippi, a town in the poorest county and the poorest state in the country, 70% of the tax revenue from the Grand Gulf nuclear station there goes to 47 other richer, whiter counties in the state just to keep the electricity rates down. In Claiborne County, meanwhile, 87% Black with a 46% poverty rate, there is one under-resourced hospital that can barely cope with its daily patient load, especially now under COVID, let alone under a nuclear emergency. And when we visited, this is what the evacuation route looked like, washed out and impassable. And when a nuclear disaster strikes, who pays? Before that fateful day on March the 11th, 2011, when the Fukushima reactors began their meltdown, the legal radiation exposure limit for the Japanese public was 1 millisievert a year. Still too high, but after the disaster, when cleaning up the radioactive contamination proved an impossible task, the Japanese government just raised the exposure limit by 20 times. So now it is 20 millisieverts a year, unsafe for anyone, but especially babies born and still in the womb and children and women. An undeniable violation of human rights. Before Fukushima, there was Chernobyl, and before that, Church Rock, and before that, 3 Mile Island, and before that, Mayak. And after these, where? Zaporizhia, Rivne, Diablo Canyon? Church Rock is the least known major nuclear disaster, and it returns us to the Navajo community. It happened on July 16th, 1979, just over 3 months after the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident, and ironically on the same date and in the same state as the first ever atomic test, the 1945 detonation Trinity in New Mexico. At Church Rock, 90 million gallons of liquid radioactive waste and 1,100 tons of solid mill waste burst through a broken dam at the Church Rock uranium mill facility, creating a flood of deadly effluents that permanently contaminated the Puerco River, an essential water source for the Navajo people. It was the biggest accidental release of radioactive waste in US history, but it happened far away to people who didn't count, just one more chapter in the quiet genocide. And Chernobyl, a disaster like Chernobyl, just like 3 Mile Island and Fukushima, brings out the most terrible amount of lies. At 3 Mile Island, Fukushima, no one died. At Chernobyl, it was just a handful of liquidators. We have to confront these lies. We can point to the compromised World Health Organization, taken hostage and gagged by the nuclear power promoting International Atomic Energy Agency. We can call out the ivory towered think tank experts who assure us these disasters really weren't all that bad. We can expose the climate denying dilettantes, and you know who I mean, who pick the data pits out of the cherries and call them empirical. Or we can listen to the people to whom it actually happened. Let's listen. Here's a father, Nikolai Fomich Kalugin, as he told it to Svetlana Alexievich in her book, Voices from Chernobyl. Can you imagine 7 bald girls together? There were 7 of them in the ward. No, that's it. I can't go on. Talking about it gives me this feeling like my heart is telling me this is an act of betrayal, because I have to describe her as if she was just anyone, describe her agony. We put her on the door my father once lay on, until they brought the little coffin. It was so tiny, like the box for a large doll, like a box. I want to bear witness. My daughter died from Chernobyl, and they want us to forget about it. Or we can listen to the stories from Fukushima, where it has been mainly women, mothers who have campaigned for recognition, for justice. And now a group of 6 young people with thyroid cancer who were children at the time of the disaster have filed a lawsuit holding TEPCO responsible. After I was diagnosed with cancer, I was told clearly there is no causation between your thyroid cancer and the nuclear accident in Fukushima. I still remember the indescribable feeling and my mother's tears, testified one young woman. Said another, still undergoing treatment for her thyroid cancer. I often become mentally and physically unstable, and I'm very worried about the future. The same goes for marriage and having a child. I often experience a feeling of despair. Nuclear power lays waste to lives, and it makes waste. Where does that waste go? When it is reprocessed, as it has been in France and England, it goes into the air and into the sea and into living, breathing organisms, including children. Children played in radioactive tide pools on English beaches near the Sellafield reprocessing plant, and they got leukemia. Children living close to operating nuclear power plants also show disproportionately high rates of leukemia compared to their peers living further away. Carbon-14, which spews from the French reprocessing facility at La Hague, hangs like an invisible, lethal fog over the dairy farms of Normandy. The liquid discharges from Sellafield and La Hague set off on their journey to contaminate the shores of Ireland and Scandinavia. They have made the Irish Sea the most radioactively contaminated sea in the world. But no matter the evidence, the nuclear industry and its supporters in government deny and lie and downplay. And what of that mass of highly lethal, long-lived radioactive waste, the real product of nuclear power? Where does that go? Should it be stored, buried, locked away, or retrievable? Who takes care of it, and for how long? And so we return to the lands of indigenous peoples and communities of color. Yucca Mountain, for a time the chosen destination for America's high-level radioactive waste, ripples across western Shoshone land in Nevada. We are back in the dream time with stories of serpents. The Shoshone call Yucca Mountain serpent swimming westward. It is a sacred place. It is also theirs by treaty, a treaty the United States has chosen to ignore, to break. There is nothing out there, claims the US government. Nothing. That is the sum total of how the Western Shoshone is seen by the Department of Energy and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. They don't exist. But the eyes of the Western Shoshone do see, and what they see are quaking aspens, a tree species that dates back 80,000 years, times buckwheat, a plant that only exists on 5 acres there and nowhere else on Earth. There is the desert tortoise and the devil's hole pupfish, a fish that somewhere in its evolutionary history went from salt water to fresh water. And of course, there are people, native people, trying hard to preserve this precious corner of their history and the land they look after. There are many other stories for which we do not have time tonight, but let's keep telling them. Let's remind the nuclear deniers over and over that nuclear power is not some abstract feat of engineering. It hurts people. It is a weapon of mass destruction. And as such, it is something that we should all be in favor of banning. So before I close, I'd like to read a short excerpt from a poem by Joseph Bruchac. He's an Abenaki Indian, and the poem is called War Dance, As Long as the Grass. And this is just an excerpt from the middle. The half-life of radioactive wastes manufactured by our nuclear plants can be measured in tens of thousands of years. The glaciers return to the poles, but these will remain faithful through the ages. It is as if the poison which killed a Roman emperor stayed in the air until today, killing every person who breathed it. It is as if the spear which wounded the side of Christ still hung invisible on the hill of Golgotha, goring every living creature which came close to that place. It is as if the stone Cain hurled against his brother were orbiting a tiny evil moon, striking down guilty and innocent from that time on. And the sun watches. We do not see him. We do not accept the gift offered freely. There is no profit in solar power. There is power in the reactor's poison. There is profit in oil, in coal, in the rape of our mother to bring forth her black blood, and bones burning in factories, smoke choking sky, acid rain weeping into mountain lakes, trout dying, trees dying, the water bitter. And Grandmother Moon fills up the night. Grandmother Moon fills even our dreams with the light of sun, the light they have not seen. So I'll stop there. Thank you for listening. I'm just going to leave this slide up for a minute so you can catch the addresses of our website and our phone number and my email, and then I'll turn it back to Gail and Jan and stop screen sharing.